Hello guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. In this mini series, I'm going to walk you through implementing Google Authentication in Next.js, Nodejs, and Express application. And we are going to be using Postgres and Sequelize for our database. So before we go forward, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share if you haven't done that already. And I'm going to start by demoing how the application should work. This is what we're building, and this is how it's going to look like by the end of the mini series. So we have a login button. This button does two things. It does both the sign up and the login at the same time. So when we click here, we have our consent screen, and which is our accounts, then password, and next. Then that's it. It signs us through the application. So this is our homepage. So we've been redirected to this homepage after the sign-in process was successful. So this is what we'll be building in this tutorial, and I look forward to making it a very interesting ride for both of us. So let me first of all go by explaining the flow to you. So I came up with this diagram to better explain how it works under the hood for this particular method of implementing Google OAuth. So we have our Next.js front end, and the first that is our login page. So the login page makes a request. Clicking on that button, a request the package that we use for the login, the OAuth login here, the package that's been used, makes a request and gets the access token from the Google API servers. And then we use that token to make that request to Google, and Google authorizes us to make that request to Google. Google shows us a consent screen for us to verify or allow that authentication process to go forward. So we do that by picking our account and accepting the authentication process. Then Google in turn gets a certain code from the URL after you've accepted the authentication process, after you've given a consent to the process. So it gets the code from the URI and then verifies the code and sends your information back. Sends your information, and that information is being used by passportjs on the backend to register you to our Postgres database, and then in turn we return a user's object and the JSON web token back to the front end. And from the front end, by the time we get that token, we now log the user into the application using front end browser cookies. So if you would want to know more about this, if you want to get this file, I'm going to paste it in the description section below for you to look at it. And in case you have any issues, you can comment in the comment section below. So let's kick off and implement this flow. So we start by, I'm going to just close this. So we start by creating our Express server. So let's do that. So let's go into desktop, and I'm going to make a directory. I'm going to create a folder called auth example, or what do we call it? Google OAuth, Google Express, Google Express OAuth. So let's cd into it, and let's open it inside our favorite code editor, which in this case is VS Code. So inside our VS Code, we have this empty directory. So we're going to start our server by first of all initializing our npm configurations here. So let's initialize npm by running init with the y flag. It creates a it creates our package.json file. So this is our package.json file, and then we are going to install a number of dependencies for our backend server. So I have I'm installing Express body parser course, that's course.env, JSON web token, Morgan passport, and passport Google token. Then page is for our Postgres, and then Sequelize. So let's go ahead and install this. Now that we've installed our dependencies, let us install our dev dependencies. These dev dependencies, we're going to use them for compiling and doing some development jobs. So we have our Babel configuration, Babel dependencies. Then we have the Sequelize CLI. Then a node for running the server. Let's install them. Good. So after installing this, let's go ahead and set up our Babel configuration. Babel RC. And inside our Babel RC, we're going to have our presets. We've installed the presets and we've installed CLI plugins, and let's go ahead and set them up. So we have preset, and inside we have and then we're going to ignore some directories: node, module, and then plugins. So inside our plugins we have the Babel plugin runtime helps us externalize reference to help us search built-in functions and rest. Then it also helps us automatically polyfile our code without polluting our globals. And then we have plugin proposal optional chaining. It helps us compile optional chaining operators, such as, let's say, anyways, I'm going to let's continue. You're going to see an example of an optional chaining. So let's go ahead and create a source directory, and inside our source directory we have our server inside our index.js file, and our server is going to contain a set number of configurations. So let's set the configurations. We have our Express app, then app.use. We're going to set up the configurations for course, have origin through body parser, again, URL included, and we have form, logger, then we're going to have a basic route for get route, request response, and then I'm just going to send welcome to my Google OAuth Express server. Then we're going to listen. So we have our, first of all, create a port equals process .env .port, or take 500 let's say 2000, so that our front end can be 3000. So we are listening on board. Then going to have server running on. So let's create a development script. And in here we have load one. Exec bubble load. So let's run our server npm run dev. Where is this coming from? Okay, from here. So our server is running on port 2000. So this is the welcome message from our port. Good. So we have our server running, and next step is going to be setting up Sequelize. So let's start by creating a file called Sequelize rc. Inside we're going to require the path module, and we're going to do module export. So we're going to have config for database configurations. Inside a DB folder, and it's going to be a JavaScript config file. Modules, path. And we'll have our CVS path. And lastly, we'll have a migration, and that's it. So let's save that. Let's run Sequelize in it. So running Sequelize in it, we're going to create just going to run this file, and then it will create these 4 folders, 3 files and 1 folder. So we have that created here. We have our migrations, models, headers. So inside our config, we are going to change this. This is JSON data, so I'm going to remove this, and we will set up a JavaScript configuration inside that file. So in here we already installed our .env package, so let's require .env because we'll be using some environment variables here. So let's run the config function, and then we have to export the configuration. So the development environment will have database, I'm going to call it OAuth. Let's just say OAuth example, or Google OAuth. Yep, let's call it Google OAuth. And then we're going to use env variable and in this case it's going to be an environment variable. So this environment variable will have the name, database, dev URL. Then let's give it dialect of Postgres. Now we are done with the configurations for the development. Normally I would just want to have this, but I'm going to add the configuration for production in case you would want to have your own server be on production, even though that is not part of our agenda in this tutorial. So I'm just going to add the production configuration, database, and we're just going to have pretty much the same thing, just a few changes. Instead of dev, I'm just going to remove it like that, just database URL. And then for our dialect, we're going to have certain options that I would want to set, such as the SSL dialect option, and then SSL. Let's set the SSL restrictions require true, then reject false, and that's it. We are done with our database connection settings. So let's go ahead and create scripts that we will run to create our database. So inside our package.json, let's add one more script to the dev script. And let's add the scripts for building the server, for compiling the server to ES5, because we will be using ES6 in this case. So to do that, we're going to start by having a clean script. This clean script is going to be used to clear the build folder. So I'm going to remove the build folder like this, and then I'm going to create it back. And then we will have a pre-build script. This pre-build script runs before the build script, and our pre-build script is going to clean the build folder, and then our build script will now compile our code. The build script uses Babel and compiles the source folder into the build folder, then ignores node modules folder. After the build field, after the build script, give our database setup. So I'm setting up, this is script for setting up the database. So this script is going to create our database using our CLI, Sequelize CLI, db create. So by the time I run the script, it is going to run whatever the code we have inside our config.js and create that database that we've given inside that config.js. And then we would need a migration script for running our migration. This is for creating migrations. So we'll have Sequelize. This script is used for creating migration. And then we have, and then this script is used to undo the migrations, and then this script is used to delete and create the migrations. So in this case, creating means to delete and create the database tables. So this is what it does. So the first script is to create our database. The second script is to create database tables, And the third script is to delete the database tables, while the last script is to create and delete the database tables. So let's go ahead and add our env file. So we have the env variable file, and inside we have just one environment variable that we would need to have development. So in here we are going to have Postgres. There are certain configurations for, so it depends. So for you to set this script, you would need to have a setup. You need to set up a server for Postgres on one of your Postgres management tools, such as pgadmin. In this case, you should use you can use pgadmin or any other one that's available. So I already did that, and I created my server for Postgres database. So I'm just going to enter my URL for the database. So this is the name of the username. My username is Postgres. So this is the username, Postgres. Password is just my name, and then my the host is the local host, and 5432, which is our port. And lastly, we have our database name, which is Google OAuth. Make sure this name matches the name you have in here. So it needs to match that name. So that's it. You have our database set up, and let's go ahead and create our database and the rest of the dependencies required. So let's do npm run db create, not db create, but db setup. So here we go. It says database Google OAuth created. So our database has been created successfully. So our next step would be to create a migration for the database. The migration is the table. So I'm going to use a Sequelize CLI again to generate the table. So we have model generate. The name, I'm going to call it user. So just the name is usually in singular. The name is always in singular, and Sequelize helps us pluralize it. So just pass it singular user, and then we have attributes of name of the user, string, email of the user, string, and password string. So let's create that migration. Now we've created our migration. This is how it looks, and our model, this is how they all look. There are a few things we missed out. So we were supposed to have the Google ID, the ID for the user, or the user's ID on Google. So that would be string. Then the provider, in case we want to have more than one auth provider, string. Okay, let's do the same inside of migrations. So for our migrations, we're going to have two more fields. One is for the Google ID, string, and the provider is string. Now that we've created our migrations and model, it is not enough to just have this. So we need to run the tables. We need to create the tables. These are just files. So we create the tables on the database by running run db migrate up. So this helps create our tables. Yep. So we have all migrations created. And now that the migrations are created, we can go ahead and set up our configurations for passportjs. So before we do that, I'm going to replace this in here. So I'm just going to replace this with the following code, even though it makes no difference, but I'm just going to replace this with that. And we have our server running. Let's run our server. So we still have our server running. So we have to now set up our Google connections, passportjs connections. So let's go inside our source directory and create another folder called routes. This is where we would have our routes. Inside the source folder. So we have the routes. Let's create our controllers. And in this case, we're just going to have one, which is the app controller. Then we're going to have our services folder, and inside services folder we're going to have Google OAuth. This is where we will set up our configuration for Google Authentication. Then let's create some routes. So we have routes. I'm going to create the routes function. This function takes in the app, this parameter, and returns the routes. So we just need to go in here and copy this. Just get it from here. And then inside our route, we paste it there. Lastly, we export the route. Then import it back inside our server here, like this. So we've imported our route here. Let's run. Let's see. So our server still runs. Now that we have that running, let's go ahead and set up our passportjs configurations. So to start with that, we're going to need the passport strategy. We're going to need passport. So let's import passport. So we're using Google token strategy, which we already installed. Then let's configure our .env. So let's do passport use. Then we're going to have our Google token strategy, and inside that Google token strategy we're going to set up the secret key and the client ID and the client secret. So we have a client ID like this. So I mean so at this point we need to go and create a client ID, client and a secret ID. So we do that by going to our browser, and then here So let's create our credentials. We have credentials. Let's create a project. Then we're going to give that name Google OAuth. And let's create let's go inside the project. Let's create the API key. So this is our API key. That will go inside secret. So this is our secret key. Then we're going to have Google client ID. Let's create our client ID. We now have let's configure the consent screen. And external, let's choose external and create app name. I'm going to say Google app. Then I'm going to put in my email as user support email. Then my email again as a developer. And let's save and continue. Okay, so it works. So let's add the scope. Let's click here. I'm going to need the email, the profile, and maybe the open ID. So just there is scope. There is scope. So let's see. Let's go. Let's move forward. No need for this. Then let's go back to our dashboard. I'm just going to publish the app at once. And then go back to our credentials and get our client and create our client secret client ID. Again, like this. Web application. This is our backend API. And then our frontend API is going to be localhost 3000. Oh, I'm just going to say 4000. And then our redirect URL is going to be localhost 4000. Then let's create our client ID. So this is our client ID. Good, so we've created our client ID, and let's continue our processes. env that Google client ID. Then we have our client secret. Good. And then let's now add our passport verify callback. It's going to be asynchronous. So this callback is called passport verify callback, and it takes in the access token, refresh token, profile, and the done. since this is an async function, I'm going to use try and catch, and our catch is going to just throw the error somewhere. And in here in our try block, there are a few things we're going to do here. One of them would be check if the user exists already, if that user coming from Google exists already. So we're going to do cons, call it existing Google account. If the account exists already, get it from me. Find one where Google ID is profile ID coming from the profile. Then after this, we're going to do an if statement, checking that if that existing Google account does not exist. So if it doesn't exist, let's find one with the email. This is just to make sure that the user wasn't created during sign up with email. So I'm checking it using this user.find one where email is going to be. So the profile, what comes from the Google API inside this profile, we don't have just one email, so it returns an array of emails. So in this case, I would need to look through them and get that email, but usually this is what I would do. I'm going to create a helper function that will help us get the email and that will help us get the user's credentials from Google. So I'm just going to call it get profile, and this function takes in profile as parameter and returns us gets the ID from Google profile, the display name. So our name inside Google servers is called display name, emails, and the provider, which is Google in this case. The good thing about this method is that the method can be used for other providers, so we can use this same get profile to get the profile coming from other providers like Facebook or LinkedIn. Email. So if the email has list of emails exist, if there are emails. So this is the optional chaining that I was talking about in the beginning. So this optional chaining like this is the same as if email exists, then email. So this is the same thing as this, but this is a shorthand for that. So we don't need to do this longhand again. So we have that, and let's get our email. Email in this case is going to be the first email in the list of emails, and get the value, and then return us our Google ID as ID, name as display name, else return null. Now let's go back here. So we were looking for a user with that email from the database, and so to get the email, we just need to pass in the get profile and get our email that's been returned from that function. And then if this is done, so if that is done, we can now can now do a last if statement. So this last if statement is going to be used to create the user. If the user is not existing, it's not inside our database. So if there is no user with Google, so what I'm doing is I'm checking if there's no user with Google account, and if there's no user with, this is actually email. So if there's no user with a Google account in our database, if there is no user with this Google account in our database, check if there is no user with this email in our database, then create the user. So we'll just say new account equals await user to create, and we do get profile like that, then return done. So this done ends promise. So it takes two parameters, error, and in this case we want to be having an error, so we're passing null, and data, which is our new account. So this is for if the user does not exist in the database, we create the user. But if the user exists in the database, just return done again, no error, and existing email user. Or lastly, if the user with Google ID existed, just return done, no existing Google account. So this handles our authentication process. And then lastly, we need to log the user into our request object. So to do that, we're going to use two passport functions called the Sequelize and Sequelize method. So we have passport.Sequelize. So what Sequelize does is it takes a callback with the user and a done function. So this function, what it does is it saves the users, or what I use it for is to save data to a cookie, a cookie in a session, something like, a cookie in a session. So it saves that event as done. So when I call it done, I'm going to pass in the data that I want to see in a cookie and in a session. Actually, in this case it's our shared session. So I'm going to be passing the user's ID. I want to save the user's ID in a session so that I can get it back using passport to Sequelize, and I'm getting it using the Sequelize method. This method takes in the ID that I saved to the session and our done function. So the ID, I'm going to use the ID to get the user from our database and save that, unlocking the user to the request object. So I'm going to have user.find, let's say find by PK, by primary key, find by ID, then now that we've gotten the user, just save the user to the request body. Else, if there is an error, catch the error. The done, the error. So we are done with the passport authentication settings. So let's go back to our Express server. All we need to do is import that file here. To have it here, we just need to import it, and there we go. Good. So we are done with the passport authentication settings for our backend server, and we're going to end this video here. We don't want to make it very long, so make sure you like, subscribe, and don't forget to comment in case you have any issues. So in our next video, I'm going to connect our endpoint to the front end, and I'm going to be adding an endpoint for a Google authentication, then connecting it with the front end and having a request be made.